At my mother's funeral, I realized my name had already been erased before she was even buried. The morning air outside Brookside Memorial Chapel was crisp, barely 50 degrees, the kind of late October chill that settles into your bones and stays there. I stood in the parking lot for a moment longer than necessary, adjusting the black wool coat I had owned for over 20 years, the one my mother once said made me look steady. I had rehearsed what I would say about her during the drive, how she made Sunday dinners feel sacred, how she could stretch $20 into a feast, how she never missed a birthday card. But when I stepped inside and reached for the funeral program, something small stopped me cold. Printed neatly beneath the words family representatives were two names, Daniel Hayes and Rachel Hayes. My son, my daughter-in-law. My own name was nowhere on the page. I traced the ink lightly with my thumb just to be certain I hadn't overlooked it. I hadn't. I folded the program carefully and slipped it into my purse as if it were fragile, as if it might shatter. Grief is strange. It doesn't always arrive as tears. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet understanding that you have been replaced. Inside the chapel, the scent of lilies was almost overpowering. Rows of white chairs stretched toward the front where my mother's casket rested beneath soft lighting. I spotted Daniel near the entrance, greeting guests with a firmness that felt rehearsed. Rachel stood beside him in a tailored black dress, her posture straight, her hand resting lightly on his arm as though she were anchoring him. When Daniel saw me, he offered a brief hug, quick and distracted. "Mom, thanks for coming early," he said, already turning to shake someone else's hand. "Thanks for coming." As if I were a distant relative who had made the trip from out of state, not the daughter who had sat beside Eleanor Brooks every afternoon during her final weeks, measuring medication, adjusting pillows, listening to stories I had heard 100 times and still treasured. An usher guided me toward a seat halfway down the aisle. The front row was already filled, Daniel, Rachel, and Rachel's parents sitting shoulder to shoulder. I lowered myself into the chair without protest. The fabric was cool beneath my palms. Around me, whispers floated softly, polite. Condolences offered in hushed tones. I watched as Rachel leaned forward to coordinate with the funeral director, nodding with quiet authority. She looked composed, almost serene, as though she had been preparing for this role for years. I remembered my mother's voice from a spring afternoon not long ago, sunlight filtering through her kitchen curtains. "Margaret," she had said gently, "pay attention to the one who organizes everything. That's the one who wants control." I had laughed at the time, brushing off the comment as old-fashioned suspicion. Now, sitting there, I felt those words settle over me like the chill outside. When the service began, I held the program in my lap and followed along as the pastor spoke. There would be a time for reflections, he announced, and my heart lifted slightly. I had written mine on a small note card tucked inside my purse. But before I could move, Rachel rose smoothly from her seat and approached the podium. "On behalf of the family," she began, her voice steady, "we want to thank you all for being here." I stayed seated. I listened. I understood something I hadn't understood before. This day was not only about saying goodbye to my mother. It was about learning who had already decided I no longer belonged at the front of my own family story. When Rachel finished speaking, there was a soft murmur of approval that moved through the chapel like a polite breeze. She spoke about devotion, about family unity, about honoring Eleanor Brooks by staying strong together. She did not mention the afternoons I spent sitting beside my mother's recliner, reading aloud from the newspaper, because her eyesight had grown weak. She did not mention the way my mother squeezed my hand when the pain medication made her drowsy. I kept my hands folded in my lap and listened as if I were hearing about someone else's life. Daniel stood next to Rachel at the podium, nodding at the appropriate moments. He looked tired, but not from grief. It was the fatigue of responsibility, the kind that comes from managing guests and logistics rather than loss. I watched him adjust his tie, the same navy tie I had given him 3 Christmases ago, and I wondered when he had started looking to Rachel before answering questions. When the pastor invited anyone else who wished to share a memory to come forward, there was a pause. A long, hollow pause. I felt the note card inside my purse pressing gently against the lining, a small square of paper carrying decades of stories. I placed my hand over it, but did not stand. Rachel turned slightly in her seat, glancing down the aisle as though measuring whether anyone would disrupt the order she had carefully arranged. No one moved. The moment passed. The service continued. I told myself that grief does not require a microphone. I told myself that my mother knew what she meant to me. Still, a quiet realization began to form. This was not about forgetting. It was about positioning. After the final hymn, guests rose slowly and formed a line to offer condolences. I remained seated for a moment longer, watching the pattern unfold. People approached Daniel and Rachel first. They shook hands, accepted hugs, received sympathetic smiles. I stood eventually and joined the line, as though I were paying respects rather than receiving them. An elderly neighbor of my mother's, Mrs. Patterson, reached for both of my hands when she saw me. "You were a good daughter, Margaret," she whispered, her eyes shining. I thanked her and felt something steady inside me again. Not everyone had forgotten. Not everyone had been rearranged out of the frame. In the hallway outside the chapel, near a table set with coffee and small paper cups, I heard Rachel's voice carrying in a low but deliberate tone. "Once the estate paperwork clears, we should move quickly," she was saying. "The market is still strong. Houses in that neighborhood are selling above asking price." Daniel responded with a quiet agreement. "We just need to make sure everything is signed properly." I stood still, the sound of their conversation sharper than the October air. My mother had lived in that house for 47 years. The oak tree in the front yard had been planted the summer I graduated high school. I had assumed there would be time. Time to sort through her recipe cards. Time to decide what to keep. Time to sit in her kitchen one last afternoon. Their urgency suggested something different. It suggested that the future had already been scheduled without me. I walked past them slowly, as though I had heard nothing. Rachel offered a brief smile, controlled and courteous. "We will talk soon," she said. I nodded once. "Yes," I replied evenly. "We will." In that moment, I understood that my mother's funeral was not only an ending. It was the quiet beginning of something else, something that would require me to pay attention in ways I never had before. The reception moved to the small fellowship hall behind the chapel, a space with beige walls and folding tables covered in white paper cloths. Coffee brewed in large silver urns near the back, and plates of store-bought cookies sat untouched beneath clear plastic lids. I stood near the window, watching fallen leaves collect along the curb outside, and tried to steady the quiet rhythm of my breathing. Daniel approached me with 2 cups of coffee, handing one over as though performing a courtesy he had rehearsed. "You holding up all right?" he asked, not quite meeting my eyes. I nodded once. "I am," I said. It was the truth, though not in the way he assumed. Grief had settled into something calm and observant inside me. It no longer rushed. It listened. Rachel joined us moments later, her voice soft but purposeful. "We are planning to meet with the attorney on Thursday," she said, as if informing a colleague of a scheduled conference call, "just to make sure everything transitions smoothly." The word transitions lingered in the air. I looked at her carefully, noticing how easily she used language that made endings sound efficient. "That sounds organized," I replied. Daniel shifted his weight slightly. "Mom, it will be easier if we handle most of the paperwork," he said. "You do not need the stress." I studied his face, the lines at the corners of his eyes that had deepened over the years. I remembered teaching him to ride a bicycle in that very neighborhood, running beside him for nearly half a block before letting go. He had been afraid to pedal alone then. Now he spoke as if I were the one who needed protecting. "I am not afraid of paperwork," I said gently. Rachel offered a small smile that did not reach her eyes. "Of course not," she answered, though her tone suggested otherwise. As the afternoon thinned and guests began to leave, I found myself drifting toward the exit. Near the doorway, Mr. Collins, my mother's longtime attorney, stood with a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. He had known our family for decades. His hair was thinner now, but his posture remained straight and deliberate. "Margaret," he said quietly, stepping aside from the crowd, "your mother asked me to speak with you before anything is finalized." I felt something steady and familiar in his voice. Not urgency, not alarm, just intention. "About the estate?" I asked. He nodded once. "There are instructions she left that are very specific. She wanted you present when they are reviewed." I glanced across the hall. Rachel was gathering sympathy cards into a neat stack, directing Daniel to help carry floral arrangements to their car. The choreography of efficiency continued uninterrupted. "Thursday," Mr. Collins added softly, "at 10 in the morning. My office." I inclined my head. "I will be there." He placed his hand briefly over mine, a gesture of quiet reassurance, then stepped away. Outside, the sky had turned a muted gray, the sun lowering behind a row of maple trees that bordered the parking lot. I walked to my car alone. The engine hummed to life with a familiar vibration, and for a moment I sat still, hands resting on the steering wheel. I thought about my mother's kitchen table, the scratches along its surface, the drawer that always stuck unless you pulled it at an angle. I thought about Rachel's certainty, about Daniel's compliance, about the word transitions spoken so smoothly over paper cups of coffee. My mother had not been careless. She had been observant, even in her final months. As I pulled out of the parking lot and turned onto Maple Avenue, I understood that what had seemed like displacement might only be the beginning of a much clearer picture. And for the first time that day, I did not feel erased. I felt prepared. Thursday morning arrived with a pale wash of sunlight across my kitchen floor, the kind that makes dust particles visible in the air. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the sink, watching steam curl upward in slow, quiet spirals. The house felt different without my mother's daily phone calls. For years, she had called at precisely 8:30, asking what I was doing, even if she already knew the answer. The silence now was not loud. It was spacious. I dressed carefully in a navy sweater and pressed slacks. Nothing dramatic, nothing fragile. I was not attending a ceremony. I was attending a meeting. At 9:30, I locked my front door and drove toward Mr. Collins's office downtown, passing familiar streets lined with brick storefronts and early morning commuters. The air was cool, about 55 degrees, crisp enough to keep the sky clear. I parked along the curb and sat for a moment before stepping out, remembering the last time I had been inside that building. My mother had insisted on reviewing her paperwork herself, even when her hands trembled slightly from fatigue. Details matter, she had told me, tapping the folder on her lap, especially when people think they already know the ending. Mr. Collins greeted me in the reception area with the same measured nod he had offered at the funeral. His office smelled faintly of polished wood and old books. He motioned for me to sit across from his desk, then opened the leather folder with deliberate care. "Your mother was very clear," he began. "She made revisions 6 months ago." I listened without interrupting, my hands folded loosely in my lap. He slid a document toward me. The pages were neatly organized, paragraphs aligned with precise language. There was nothing emotional about it. No dramatic flourishes. Just clarity. She understood that transitions can create misunderstandings, he continued, his voice even. So she structured the estate to require joint consent on any major decisions. I looked up. Joint consent between whom? I asked. He met my eyes directly. Between you and Daniel. The words settled quietly between us. Not Daniel and Rachel. Not Daniel alone. Me and my son. Your mother wanted to ensure that you remained fully involved, he added. No property can be sold. No accounts can be altered without both signatures. I let out a slow breath, not in relief, but in recognition. My mother had seen the current forming long before I had acknowledged it. There is also a letter, Mr. Collins said, retrieving a sealed envelope from the folder. She asked that I give this to you privately. The paper felt thick beneath my fingers. I did not open it immediately. Instead, I traced the familiar curve of her handwriting across the front of the envelope. Margaret. No embellishments. Just my name. Take your time, Mr. Collins said gently. I nodded once and placed the letter in my purse for later. Some words deserve quiet when they are read. As I stood to leave, he added, your mother was not worried about you being strong. She was worried about you being sidelined. The phrasing was exact. Not controlled. Not defeated. Sidelined. I stepped back onto the sidewalk, the morning sun now brighter against the windows of nearby buildings. Cars passed steadily along Main Street, the city continuing its rhythm without pause. I understood something with unusual clarity. This was never about money. It was about presence. About whether I would step forward or allow myself to be guided toward the back row again. I walked to my car with measured steps, aware that Thursday had already shifted the balance of what was to come. When I arrived home that afternoon, the house felt unusually still, as though it had been waiting for me to understand something before allowing itself to breathe again. I set my purse on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, staring at the envelope my mother had left behind. The paper caught the light from the window, soft and steady. I made myself a cup of tea first. Routine has a way of keeping emotions from spilling over. The kettle whistled faintly, and I poured the hot water slowly, watching the steam rise. Only after I sat down at the small oak table did I slide the envelope out and break the seal carefully along the edge. Her handwriting filled the page in firm, familiar strokes. "Margaret," she began, "if you are reading this, it means you are standing where I once stood, wondering how things shifted so quietly." I paused, pressing my lips together. She wrote about the early years after my father passed, about how quickly people offered advice disguised as help. She reminded me that kindness is valuable, but boundaries are essential. "Do not mistake silence for peace," she wrote. "Sometimes silence is simply someone else rearranging the room while you are not looking." I read the letter twice before folding it neatly and placing it back inside the envelope. There was no bitterness in her words, only clarity. She did not accuse anyone. She did not instruct me to fight. She asked me to remain present. That evening, Daniel called just after 7. His voice sounded measured, almost cautious. "Rachel and I were thinking about Saturday," he said. "We could start sorting through Grandma's things. The sooner we organize, the easier it will be." I leaned against the kitchen counter and looked out the window at the fading light across the yard. "I will be there," I replied evenly. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Good," he said. "We want to move forward efficiently." The word efficiently again. I ended the call and placed the phone face down on the counter. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze moving through the neighborhood where my mother's house stood. The oak tree in the front yard cast long shadows across the driveway. When I stepped inside, the scent of her lavender sachets lingered faintly in the air. Rachel was already in the living room, opening drawers, stacking photo albums into neat piles. Daniel carried boxes from the hallway closet as though completing a task on a checklist. "We should focus on valuables first," Rachel said without looking up. "That way we know what we are working with." I set my purse on the arm of the sofa and walked slowly through the room. Every object felt deliberate. The porcelain figurines on the mantel, the worn indentation on the armchair where my mother used to sit. "Nothing leaves this house without both signatures," I said calmly. The room stilled for half a second. Rachel's hand paused over a silver frame. Daniel straightened, confusion crossing his face. "What do you mean?" he asked. I met his eyes steadily. "Your grandmother made her intentions clear. Major decisions require both of us." Rachel's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, like a curtain drawn halfway closed. "Of course," she replied smoothly. "We just thought it would be easier if we handled things quickly." I nodded once. Easier is not the same as correct. No one raised their voice. No one argued. The air simply changed. I walked toward the kitchen and opened the drawer that always stuck unless you pulled it at an angle. It slid open with a familiar resistance. Inside lay a stack of handwritten recipes, tied with a faded ribbon. I lifted them carefully, understanding now that presence is not loud. It does not demand attention. It remains steady. And for the first time since the funeral, I did not feel like I was standing in the back of the room. I was exactly where I belonged. The afternoon light shifted slowly across the living room floor as we continued sorting through drawers and cabinets, but the rhythm had changed. Daniel moved more carefully now, glancing at me before placing anything into a box. Rachel still maintained her composure, yet there was a faint tightness around her smile, the kind that appears when someone realizes the script has been adjusted without their consent. I remained steady, opening cabinets, folding linens, stacking dishes with deliberate care. My mother had never rushed through her kitchen, even when guests were waiting at the table. She believed that how you handled small things revealed how you would handle larger ones. In the hallway, Daniel carried down a small wooden chest from the linen closet. "We should inventory jewelry and keepsakes," he said, setting it gently on the dining table. Rachel stepped closer immediately. "That would be practical," she replied. I noticed how quickly she positioned herself near the items that held obvious value. I approached the table without haste. "Inventory is wise," I agreed, "and it will be documented properly." I opened the chest myself. Inside were modest pieces, most of them sentimental rather than extravagant. A pearl necklace my father had saved for months to purchase. A simple gold watch with a scratched face. A pair of earrings my mother wore every Sunday for nearly 40 years. I lifted each piece carefully and placed it back into the velvet lining after examining it. "We will list these with Mr. Collins," I said calmly. Daniel nodded. though his expression revealed he had not expected such formality. Rachel folded her arms lightly. "That seems unnecessary for personal items," she said, her tone even but edged with impatience. I met her gaze without raising my voice. Nothing is unnecessary when clarity is involved. Silence followed. Not hostile, just revealing. The afternoon stretched into early evening. Boxes lined the hallway now, labeled in Daniel's handwriting. Kitchen, living room, personal effects. I moved into my mother's bedroom last, standing for a moment at the doorway. The bed was neatly made, as she always insisted it be. The curtains were half drawn, allowing a band of golden light to rest across the dresser. I opened the top drawer slowly and found stacks of folded handkerchiefs, each one ironed and arranged with precision. Beneath them lay a small notebook. I flipped through its pages and found dates, notes about birthdays, reminders to send cards. My name appeared often, sometimes with simple phrases. Beside it, call Margaret. Ask about her garden. The evidence of care was quiet and unmistakable. Daniel appeared behind me. "Mom, we are trying to make this efficient," he said gently. I turned toward him, holding the notebook in my hand. "Efficiency is not the same as understanding," I replied. He looked at the pages, then back at me, and something softened in his expression. Perhaps for the first time that day, he saw not paperwork, not property, but connection. Rachel's voice called from down the hall, asking about the attic. I closed the notebook and placed it into my purse. "We will go through everything," I said clearly, stepping past him. Together. There was no argument this time, only a quiet recalibration. As the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows lengthened along the hardwood floors, I understood that presence is not a demand. It is a decision, and I had made mine. By the time we reached the attic, dusk had settled over the neighborhood, casting the house into a softer shade of gray. Daniel pulled down the narrow ladder from the ceiling hatch in the hallway, and a faint cloud of dust drifted into the air as the wooden steps unfolded. Rachel stood with her arms crossed, watching as if timing how long the process would take. I placed my hand on the first rung before Daniel could climb up. "I will go," I said quietly. He hesitated. "Mom, it is cramped up there." I met his gaze evenly. I have been climbing into tight spaces my entire life. He stepped aside without argument. The attic air was dry and carried the faint scent of old cardboard and insulation. A single bulb hung from a cord in the center, casting a muted circle of light across stacked boxes and covered furniture. I moved carefully, brushing my fingers along the lids of containers labeled in my mother's precise handwriting. Christmas ornaments, school papers, photos. Each box represented a decade, a season, a version of our family before roles had shifted and voices had rearranged the order of things. Daniel joined me after a moment, his footsteps cautious on the wooden boards. Rachel remained below, her voice floating upward. "Focus on anything valuable," she called. "We can donate the rest." I did not respond. Instead, I opened a long flat box tucked beneath a folded quilt. Inside were framed photographs, edges slightly worn but preserved with care. One showed Daniel at 8 years old, missing his front tooth, grinning beside the oak tree in the yard. Another captured my mother standing beside me on my wedding day, her expression proud and steady. I handed the photographs to Daniel one by one. He studied them longer than I expected. "I forgot about this," he said quietly, tracing the corner of one frame. His voice had shifted, no longer managerial, no longer efficient, just reflective. "You did not forget," I replied. "You were busy." Below us, Rachel's phone chimed with a notification. She spoke softly into it for a moment, likely confirming an appointment or checking a listing. Her world continued at its usual pace. Up here, time felt slower. I found another small wooden box, lighter than I anticipated. Inside were letters bound with a ribbon. The top envelope bore Daniel's name in my mother's handwriting. I passed it to him without comment. He held it carefully, then slid it into his jacket pocket instead of placing it into a box. The choice was subtle, but it mattered. "We will review everything before anything leaves this house," I said clearly, loud enough for Rachel to hear. She did not reply immediately. When she finally did, her tone was smooth but restrained. "Of course, we just need to be realistic." I climbed down the ladder slowly, carrying the box of photographs against my chest. Standing back in the hallway, I looked around the house once more. The walls still held the quiet imprint of decades. The air carried memory in ways paperwork never could. Daniel descended behind me, holding the letters carefully. Rachel glanced between us, her expression unreadable. Something had shifted again, not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably. The attic had not revealed treasure in the way Rachel might have hoped. It had revealed continuity. And continuity does not fit neatly into moving boxes. As we gathered our coats and prepared to leave for the evening, I realized that control is not always about documents and signatures. Sometimes it is about who remembers what truly belongs to a family, and who refuses to let it be reduced to inventory. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, the house still wrapped in a soft blue silence. For a few moments I lay in bed listening to the hum of the heater, and the distant sound of a delivery truck somewhere down the street. My body felt tired, but my mind was unusually clear. The day before had not been loud or dramatic, yet it had altered something fundamental. I rose slowly, made my bed with the same deliberate motions my mother had practiced for decades, and walked into the kitchen to start the coffee. The scent filled the room, grounding and familiar. At 8:15, my phone vibrated on the counter. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring once more before answering, not out of avoidance, but out of intention. "Good morning," I said evenly. His voice sounded different, less rehearsed. "Mom, I read the letter Grandma left me last night," he began. There was a pause, the kind that carries weight. She wrote about responsibility, about not confusing leadership with ownership. I leaned against the counter and looked out at the bare branches in the backyard. She had a way of saying difficult things gently, I replied. He exhaled slowly. "Rachel thinks we should still move forward with listing the house soon. She says the market will not wait." I did not respond immediately. The morning light had begun to stretch across the kitchen table, illuminating the grain in the wood. "The market has no memory," I said calmly. "But families do." Another silence followed, longer this time. "I do not want you to feel pushed aside," Daniel said quietly. It was the first time he had acknowledged what had been happening without disguising it as efficiency. "I am not," I answered. "Not anymore." We agreed to meet again that afternoon at the house, this time without the urgency of boxes and labels. When I arrived, Rachel was already there, standing in the living room with a clipboard in hand. She looked composed, but there was a sharper edge to her stillness. "We need to set a timeline," she said as soon as I stepped inside. "Buyers are scheduling showings weeks in advance." I removed my coat slowly and hung it on the familiar brass hook near the door. "No one is scheduling anything without both signatures," I replied, my tone steady and unhurried. Daniel stood between us, his posture less certain than before. He glanced at Rachel, then at me. "Maybe we should slow down," he said. The words surprised even him. Rachel's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the strain beneath her calm. "Slowing down can cost money," she said. "Rushing can cost trust," I answered. The room fell quiet. Outside, a car passed along the street, tires humming softly against the pavement. I walked toward the window and looked out at the oak tree my father had planted decades ago. Its branches were bare now, but strong. Seasons do not erase roots. They test them. Daniel stepped closer to the window beside me. "I do not want this to become a battle," he said under his breath. I turned slightly toward him. "Then do not treat it like a transaction." Behind us, Rachel closed her clipboard with a firm but controlled motion. "We are only trying to be practical," she insisted. I faced her fully then, meeting her gaze without hostility. "Practicality is not the same as priority," I said. "Right now, our priority is honoring what was built here, not how quickly we can convert it into something else." No one raised their voice. No one stormed out. The shift was quieter than that. It was the sound of someone realizing they no longer controlled the entire narrative. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt not displaced, not sidelined, but anchored. The house did not feel like an asset. It felt like a responsibility, and I intended to carry it with clarity. The house grew quieter after that afternoon, not because words had stopped, but because they had finally begun to mean something. Daniel stayed behind when Rachel stepped outside to take a call, pacing near the driveway with her phone pressed to her ear. I could see her silhouette through the front window, sharp and purposeful against the fading daylight. Inside, the living room felt steadier. Daniel stood near the fireplace, looking at the framed photograph of my mother that still rested on the mantel. I did not realize how quickly I shifted into planning mode, he said quietly. It felt responsible. I sat down in the armchair where my mother had once spent her evenings knitting. The cushion dipped in the same familiar way. Responsibility without reflection becomes replacement, I replied. He looked at me then, fully, not as someone to manage, not as an obstacle, but as his mother. I do not want to replace you, he said. There was no defensiveness in his voice. Now, only recognition. Outside, Rachel ended her call and returned inside, her expression composed but less certain than before. We need clarity, she said evenly. Are we keeping the house or not? The question hung in the air, stripped of urgency but still direct. I rose slowly and walked toward the dining room table where the wooden chest still sat closed. We are not deciding today, I answered. We are understanding first. Rachel's jaw tightened slightly. Understanding does not pay property taxes, she said. I met her gaze without hostility. Neither does haste. Daniel stepped forward then, his voice steady in a way I had not heard since before the funeral. We are not listing the house yet, he said. We will review everything together. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. The balance had shifted, not because I had argued louder, but because I had refused to disappear. The room settled into a different kind of silence, one that carried adjustment rather than avoidance. Later, as we prepared to leave for the evening, I walked alone into the kitchen one last time. I ran my hand lightly across the counter where my mother used to roll out pie dough every Thanksgiving. The surface was worn smooth from years of repetition. I understood then that love is not proven by who speaks the most at a funeral or who organizes paperwork the fastest. It is revealed in who stays present when decisions are being made. Outside, the sky had deepened into a cool indigo. The oak tree stood still against the horizon, its branches reaching upward without apology. Daniel locked the front door and handed me a spare key without being asked. We will come back next week, he said quietly. I nodded once and slipped the key into my purse beside my mother's letter. Rachel walked ahead toward their car, her steps measured but no longer leading. I stood for a moment on the driveway, breathing in the cool evening air, aware that grief had changed shape. It no longer felt like being pushed to the back row. It felt like standing exactly where I was meant to stand, steady and seen. I had not learned who loved me because they said it. I learned because they adjusted when I refused to step aside. And sometimes that is the clearest answer a family can give.